this meeting. So the first section, the presentations will be recorded, but then the Q&A won't be. So just to make everybody aware. So what I'm going to do is just quickly introduce each of the speakers and give a little introduction of the kind of the overarching theme, and then the order of the speakers. So Peidong Yang will be speaking first, and then Tom Brotherhood, and then Cheng Yan. So Peidong Yang is an assistant professor at the National Institute of Education in Singapore, a sociologist of education, and published extensively on the topic of international student mobility, focusing on Singapore and also China. And he's the author of International Mobility and Educational Desire, Chinese Foreign Talent Students in Singapore. Then Tom Brotherhood, an assistant professor at Rikkyo University in Japan. So his research is focused on the internationalization of higher education and international student mobility, with a particular focus on Japan. And his presentation today is looking at the role that Japanese universities are playing as intermediaries in international student mobility. Ian Cheng is a research fellow in the Asian Migration Cluster at the Asia Research Institute, National University of Singapore. So his research interests lie at the intersection of education, youth, and mobilities in Asian cities, and his current research is focused on international student mobility along the Belt and Road. So today we have three presentations that look at kind of in different ways shift towards Asia in flows of globally mobile students. So a shift that's kind of taken place over the past decade and a half, obviously reflecting broader changes in the global political economy. So as Ian pointed out in his abstract, this shift seems to have been kind of accelerated by the pandemic. And there seems to be a consensus among scholars in the field that over the next few years, Asian students seeking global mobility may look closer to home, although really that remains to be seen. But nonetheless, the shift taking place is clear. So while mobility to Europe and North America continues to characterize a significant proportion of international student mobility, in recent years, there's been a move away from the dominance of Anglophone Western countries. So according to UNESCO statistics on tertiary international student flows, in the year 2000, about 63% of international students were enrolled in North American or Western European universities. But by 2017, this region had lost around 11% of the share of globally mobile students, mostly to Asia and the Pacific. But as several scholars have noted, such as Peidong Yang and also Sarah Lepore and Francis Collins, so the empirical research on international students hasn't really kept up with these changes. So I hope that one outcome of today's webinar is that we kind of we leave with more awareness of what these changes entail and of what the implications are of increasing mobility to and also between non-Western and non-Anglophone countries. So that's it. So just a reminder, each of the presentations will be about 20 minutes. If you want to ask a question, if you can just type it in the chat box, and then we'll come to the questions in order after the three presentations are all finished. So yeah, if you want to go ahead for the first presenter, so it's yeah, Peidong. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Ben. Thank you for the introduction and for organizing this meeting. I'm very happy to be here. Now, in your introduction, you talked about the sort of theme of this workshop or meeting as, focused on, student mobility within Asia, or, student mobility centered on Asia. And I have done work primarily in that area, looking at Chinese students to Singapore and another case of Indian students studying in China. Now, so those are my, some of the past work I've done. But what I will be presenting today is not so much, I won't be, revisiting some of my previous work. Since the pandemic has had a very serious impact and still uncertain sort of outlook for international student mobility going forward, I thought what I would take this opportunity to do is also to paint a broad picture and share some reflections on how international student mobility is currently at, or what we can think about in terms of how things might develop going forward. So my presentation will not talk a lot about my previous work on Chinese to Singapore student mobility or Indian students in China, but I'll be happy to talk about those later on in the Q&A if there are interest. So as you can see from the title of my presentation, I hope you can see my slide. Okay, so I'll be the title of my presentation is Rethinking International Student Mobility, or ISM, through the crisis, through notion of crisis at the juncture of pandemic and global uncertainties. And the outline of my presentation is as follows. I'll give a quick introduction, and I'll talk a little bit about the extant theorization of ISM in the literature, sort of a very broad sort of characterization of how scholars have looked at ISM. And then I introduced this discursive device or discursive notion of framework of crisis to think about ISM, sort of differently, right? So that's my effort to try to, re-narrate, ISM from a few types of different crises, and those crises will be geopolitical crisis, economic crisis, and crisis of human capital reproduction. In the crisis of human capital reproduction, I will draw a little bit on my own research previously. And finally, I will reflect on, ISM at the current juncture of pandemic, as well as more broadly, global uncertainties that are confronting us. So that will be the outline of the presentation. Okay, just to say quickly that currently, with the pandemic still not ending yet, there's still a lot of uncertainty. Certainly, it has dealt us a huge huge crisis to international student mobility, right? But I won't be boring you with all those statistics, because we've been heard too much of this, unprecedented, unparalleled or whatever crisis to student mobility. So we're all aware of that. But I wanted to point out by quoting Outback and DeWitt, who said in 2018, so this was 2 years before the pandemic, that at that point in time, they were already thinking that, a era of higher education internationalization from 1990s to 2025, they were thinking that, that era was coming to an end. So even before the crisis, the COVID crisis hit, there were, speculations or discussion about whether, international student mobility was going to, go in the same direction or just carry on, right? And these two experts thought, thought otherwise. And indeed, there was, in 2017, there was already, evidence of ISM growth plateauing, right? So if you look at USA as the largest receiver of international students, in 2017, the number of enrollments of international students actually start to decline, right, compared to the previous year. So this was very, so even before the pandemic, there were, signs of, ISM losing steam, right? And we might want to think about why that was so. Was there a certain shift going on? And sort of I'm linking that back to Ben's, interest in, Asia-centered ISM. Okay, so but in this paper, I want to re-narrate ISM from a crisis perspective. And the crisis I'll be talking about includes the pandemic, but goes beyond it. So as I said, I will be talking about a few other, categories of crisis as well. All right, so now, but before we dive into the crisis narrative of ISM, I just want to sort of recap or synthesize, our existent understanding of international student mobility. So obviously, it's a vast and dynamic scholarly field that sort of burst onto the scene about a decade ago, right? About 2010 thereabouts. Suddenly there is this huge, burgeoning of ISM scholarship, and I thought how it is possible to sort of try to characterize this entire, huge body of a very diverse body of scholarship. I thought maybe we can use a sort of a demand-supply framework to think about it. Now, where does the demand for ISM come from, right? Demand comes from, at a basic level, desires and decisions of individuals and those families and communities behind them who seek through ISM to achieve certain instrumental and less or non-instrumental objectives through ISM, right? So the instrumental objectives could be, this idea that, going abroad to study gives you prized cultural capital that enhances your, competitiveness and so on the labor market. The non-instrumental objectives, links to those ideas that, study abroad is about experience, it's about broadening your horizon, intercultural competence. And of course, the instrumental and non-instrumental are actually linked, all right? But broadly speaking, if we think about the demand of ISM, there is this prevailing emphasis on the private and individual logic, so to speak. The term I coined the term. Basically, there's this assumption that it is individuals and people who want ISM for their own social reproduction, for their own objectives. Now, on the other hand, if we think about the supply of ISM, of course, supply responds to demand, but this purveying of ISM opportunities, which is linked to higher education internationalization more broadly, I tend to interpret it as from an institutionalist perspective, to think of ISM and more broadly, higher education internationalization as a global model of status and legitimacy that has become very powerful, right? So countries around the world, even provincial universities in China. This was from my study of Indian students studying in a provincial university in China. What I've found out is that this discourse, this idea, this model of internationalization is so powerful and legitimate, confers some kind of prestige that even mediocre, so-called or peripheral actors want to sort of jump on the bandwagon, right? And of course, this general trend of internationalization of higher education and student mobility rests on neoliberal rationales, right, and the principles of knowledge economy, because it is suggested that studying abroad, gaining cross-cultural experiences increases human capital, and that's what allows individuals to plug in more successfully into a global knowledge economy, right? So there's I'm thinking about this vast literature of international student mobility and how to theorize or how to characterize the theorization. So so this is the demand supply perspective that I try to sort of look at it. Right. Okay, so that's a quick summary or attempt to do so at existing scholarship. Now here I want to introduce a different narrative, a narrative that centers on crisis. So I want to think about ISM as responses to certain crises, or as arising out of certain crisis. In the existing framework of the supply and demand, I think there is this actor-centric view. So you're thinking, it is certain actors who are demanding ISM, and there are certain actors or institutional actors who are supplying ISM opportunities or internationalization. But because of the pandemic, I started to think, how can we develop a different narrative about ISM as response to certain crisis, and that's why this paper is what this paper is about. Now, before I dive into talking about different types of crisis and how they relate to ISM, first of all, we need to talk a little bit about crisis, because crisis is not a value-free or a transparent term, right? We need to denaturalize it in the sense that how crisis is framed, understood, seized upon, and responded to by actors as an occasion and opportunity for potential transformation may entail contestations of interest and power. In other words, politics, right? So there is always a politics of crisis. Whenever anyone utters the notion of crisis, you are uttering it from a certain, perspective, justifying certain action or justifying certain, certain view, right? So there is no neutral or value-free crisis. Crisis is always, there is a politics to it. So with that understanding of crisis, in the rest of the paper, I will talk about geopolitical crisis, economic crisis, and crisis in human capital reproduction. Now here the paper will be the arguments will be very sketchy because we don't have the time to go into each of this. It really is trying to paint a broad picture of how, give some certain examples from history, how certain crises have been linked to student mobility, how they are deeply intertwined and developed together. Right. Okay. Very quickly, geopolitical crisis. So I think as a former Chinese national and someone who was steeped in Chinese sort of view of the world, the first instance that came to my mind was actually the late Qin dynasty and early Republic China student mobility. This was a time when China, the moribund Qin dynasty, was confronted with existential crisis, and one of their ways to respond to that crisis was to send Chinese students to study in West country in the name of a self-strengthening movement, right? 自强运动. And what they hoped was that these students, after getting superior knowledge from the West, would come back and save China. But of course, it didn't work. Related to this, one of the last Qin dynasties, crisis was the Boxer Rising incident, and because of that, the Qin dynasty had to pay a huge indemnity to the USA, and the USA subsequently channeled that money to set up the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Fund, which subsequently trained thousands of Chinese students who later became the vanguard and elite of Republic of China and the Chinese modernity more broadly. So this was how in that instance, student mobility and the crisis was bound up. Now, of course, during the Cold War, we knew of the Colombo Plan in the 1950s, when more of a Southeast Asia region and South Asia and Australia, right? Students were given scholarship to study there, and it was in the broader background of the ideological background of communist versus capitalist world. USA during the Cold War era was a huge, it was the magnet for global students, and and obviously it played a huge role in boosting what we would call today, USA soft power. Now, the China, and Russia was outside the capitalist camp, and there was, significant student mobility between China and Soviet Russia, all set against this geopolitical and ideological context. Very quickly, 1989 Tiananmen incident, and which triggered which prompted the US to create this Chinese Student Protection Act, which allowed students studying in the US to remain there instead of returning to China. So that actually allowed a large number, quite a significant number of Chinese students to settle in the US, who otherwise would have found it difficult. In the new millennium, 9/11 incident was a major geopolitical incident that slowed down the development of student mobility because of the securitization of border and mobility for a period of time. But that effect was relatively temporary, because student mobility had a huge surge subsequently in after 2008, right? So it actually resumed growth. Okay. Very quickly, economic crisis. So the one example I will talk about is just global financial crisis. So according to a scholar, McCrander's study, she found that there is this significant correlation between decreasing funding in the United States for public higher education and rise in international student mobility, and a huge number of these students who arrived in the US, who were self-funded to study in the US, who kept a lot of US colleges, are still, running were students from China, right? And China's, at this point in time, China was really, rising very fast, huge middle class and, purchasing power, and they, and they're willing to spend it on American education, right? So, I'll skip the figures about how much money student mobility contributed to US, but I'll just quote Macrenda's statement. She characterized ISM as an international solution to a national crisis in the post global financial crisis American context. Right. So this was how ISM and the economic crisis was sort of bound up in this context. Right, and finally, I will talk about ISM and the crisis in human capital reproduction. Now, this draws a little bit more on my own research. So I will talk quickly about two cases, China and Singapore. Both countries have used have developed policies and schemes, strategies about surrounding ISM as a way to respond to real or perceived human capital reproduction. Now, in the case of China, at the end of 1970s, the reform and opening up, China, the leadership of China perceived that the country was really backwards and lacking in human capital, and therefore, initially in 1970s and 80s, the Chinese government sent limited number of students, but nevertheless significant, right, who went to Western countries to study, and these were sponsored by the Chinese state, who were subsequently required to come back to serve the nation, right? So this was their way to, raise the human capital level, especially for the elite scientists and cadre. From 1990s onwards, self-funded study began to take off in China, but the real takeoff was after 2000s. Now, with China becoming affluent and more Chinese are able to afford studying abroad, with or without scholarship, without foreign funding, the crisis shifted from lacking human capital to the problem of brain drain, right? So, starting in 2010, there was this discourse that China was losing too much of its talent to the Western countries, particularly the US. And in China, this it's very nationalistic and political centric kind of perspective. So there was a coordinated effort, and people like Xiang Biao have written about this, coordinated effort by the Chinese government trying to renationalize ISM in order to tap into the global circuit of talent flows, of Chinese talent flows, in order to reboost China's human capital. So it was very clear that ISM strategies from China was quite closely linked to this perceived or real crisis in human capital reproduction. In the Singapore case, also, a small island nation where I'm currently a citizen of and where I'm currently based, always this, perspective or this almost a paranoia that the country doesn't have any resources except human capital, and therefore it is essential for the state to to recruit the best, to boost its human capital base. And so what happened is that from 1980s onwards, but particularly after 1990s, the Singapore state had used very elaborate scholarship schemes, which I studied, to supplement local human capital through recruiting students from Southeast Asian and other Asian countries. But the biggest recruiting ground was mainland China, and I was one of the students who were recruited through one of these schemes. So it was but other than using inbound student mobility, sponsored inbound student mobility to boost local human capital, Singapore state also has a long-running tradition of sending an elite stratum of local students for the best of education around the world to groom them for the upper echelon of public service, right? Those who are familiar with Singaporean context will know this, right? The PSC scholarship. So again, Singapore uses student mobility very strategically to respond to perceived crisis in human capital reproduction, right? So this was my cases to illustrate how crisis in human capital reproduction and ISM are interlinked, intertwined. Okay, very quickly moving on to the last segments, just sort of very quick scanning of what has happened with the crisis and where ISM is at right now. Now, obviously, COVID-19 has dealt huge blow to ISM. The immediate crisis for ISM is oftentimes is logistical in nature, right? So, Ian and I have been working on projects about, how border control and all kinds of rules about, travel that has, implicated international students and, student recruitment for institutions, right? So there is also forced immobility, which I think Ben has written about or talked about, right, in terms of the African students in China. Another consequence of COVID obviously is the rise of racism and xenophobia, which has triggered a reassessment of the desirability of ISM and a certain ISM destinations, right? So USA, UK, Australia, I think you're all aware of what's going on in terms of the discourse. Now, I think one question here is whether how long lasting these effects would be. Would they just be a temporary sort of flash in the pan, and once pandemic's over, everything will be back to normal, or would this result in some kind of permanent reshuffle of the global ISM patterns, right? And that question has very direct implication to the theme of this seminar today, because we're talking about Asia-centered or intra-Asia kind of a student mobility as as a developing trend, right? So if the Western countries are losing grip on Asian students who form the bulk of internationally mobile students, then are we talking about some kind of a reshuffling, right? So here I think we have some contrarian conflicting evidence, right? So I think in UK, despite the pandemic, international student interest in the country's institution has not declined, and there has been a jump in international student application. Whereas in the US, we have seen a significant drop in at least in last year. This year's figures haven't been released apparently, but in 2020 there was a 43% drop in international student enrollment. But that could, you could argue either ways, right? It could be a short-term, response because of the situation that was perceived to be disastrous in the US, or so we really, it's anybody's guess, I suppose. Okay, so that's crisis, COVID-19 and the ISM's immediate crisis. And lastly, I just very quickly think about what are the longer term global uncertainties confronting ISM, as we think further, moving forward, right? Geopolitical wise, I think, the relation between China, US, respectively the largest sender and receiver of international students, the relationship isn't improving. And we also see a rising, tension between China and the rest of the world. And there are scholars arguing that China is increasingly closing in on itself. Now, if that is the case, that would be huge implication for ISM, because for the last 2 decades, China was the single most important force in driving ISM, right? So if China isn't so how ISM from China develops will dictate to a good extent how ISM globally will shift. Secondly, there's this broader issue of social compact in terms of strong backlash against globalization and cosmopolitanism, right? Because of the widespread inequality observed both in developed and developing countries, right? And of course, student mobility has been studied extensively as a mechanism of reproducing privilege, reproducing inequality, right? So with a growing awareness and backlash against this mechanism, right? Where are we going to see this go? And finally, I just want to point out very quickly two sort of existential threats or limits that lie at the far horizon of student mobility. The economic limits. Here again, I have China in mind, because China had gone through several decades of breakneck growth, and the economic growth has sustained the Chinese purchasing power to be able to study abroad. Now, if it is true that China's economy is going to slow down significantly in the coming decades, I think that might spell issue for demand for ISM. And you can apply the same argument then to other countries that may be facing economic slowdown, and the demand for ISM would correspondingly slow. Ecological limits. ISM currently, as we conceive, is still based on physical mobility, mobility of persons. But how sustainable is it, especially with the rising availability and affordability of ICT tools like that we are currently using, right? Is how ethical, how sustainable is it for us to enjoy the kind of corporeal mobility that had characterized ISM to date. So I think with with these kind of limits and the broader global trends and the uncertainties, at the outset, at the clouding the future of ISM, I think it's a opportune juncture for us to think about what lies ahead for ISM. Right. So those are just my few thoughts, here, and I would like to hear your thoughts and listen to the conversations later on. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Pedro. Yeah, that was great. And you kind of preempted my question, which, yeah, was about the kind of combination of economic and geopolitical crises and China, and also reduced returns to international student mobility. So from Chinese students returning home, kind of a sense of reduced returns on the labor market. So anyway, so if we move on now to Tom Brotherhood and his presentation on Japan. Okay, so go ahead whenever you're ready, Tom.
Thank you very much, Ben. Can you see the slides okay? Everything looking fine? Excellent. So thank you all very much for joining us today. And thank you, Pedong, for a fantastic opening contribution there. I'll try as I go through, because you've kind of laid the groundwork so strongly and given us a few arguments to kind of pick on there. I'll try to weave those in as we go through my presentation. But broadly today, I'll be giving, I would say, a more narrow presentation that's hopefully will be interesting to you all, looking specifically at the Japanese context. Now, what I want to do today is essentially draw together a couple of recent projects that I did. One of them, my doctoral project, which looked at international student migration to Japan and the UK, and I'll focus on the Japanese portion of that. But I've also done a kind of simultaneous project alongside, looking at international faculty and foreign-born faculty in the Japanese context. And I'm going to try and weave those together to really focus on the role of Japanese universities as institutions in supporting international student mobility and also supporting the migration of both students and faculty into Japanese society more broadly. So today what I'm going to do is first give a kind of an overview of an old-fashioned but still quite a strong argument that Japan is a country without migration, and sort of usurp that a little bit by looking at the waves of internationalization we've seen in Japan, and particularly focusing on what I characterize as a new wave of internationalization, which has kind of stepped away from just purely the mobility aspect and into the migration aspect. And I refer here to educationally channeled migration of both students and faculty. Now, having taken you through a little bit of data, I'll be relatively brief on that. I want to point towards a research agenda that I think is emerging in the Japanese context, which is the idea of universities as migration intermediaries more broadly, and particularly in contexts like Japan that have invested so heavily in internationalization over the past 30 years. So first of all, a country without migration. Now, the idea of Japan as a negative case is very prominent in migration studies, and it's not without justification. So on the one hand, you have the idea that Japan has the lowest proportion of its population as a foreign resident of almost any developed country. And of those foreign residents in Japan, they have a relatively low proportion who are holding permanent residency in Japan and an extremely low naturalization rate. So these are kind of statistical reasons why we sometimes describe Japan as a country without migration. But it is also, this is all against the backdrop of a long-standing government stance where the Ministry of Justice said in the 1960s that all migrants to Japan will only be admitted on a temporary basis. And this is kind of an idea that is pretty alive and well in Japanese political discussion today around migration. But this kind of overlooks the fact that Japan also has a simultaneous history of both front and side door migration pathways that have brought enormous populations of foreign workers to Japan in different contexts. These began in the 1960s when trainee policies were introduced, which were essentially a kind of, in some ways, an early form of student mobility, where people were invited to come to Japan to train in particular unskilled and some skilled positions, particularly like caring professions, nurses and caregivers and things like that. And following their training, they were permitted to remain in Japan afterwards to work for 3 to 5 years, depending on the particular political era, and work in Japan before some of them would remain and others would return home. There's also the Nikkei Returnee policies, which is essentially where co-ethnic or Japanese descendants who had emigrated from Japan in the recent past were invited to return to Japan to work throughout the late 1980s and early 90s. And of course, highly skilled migrants have been desired since the 1980s. And there's been various degrees of success around that. So what I think the recent scholarship around this is basically kind of fallen upon is that Japan is not a country without migration, but is a country that is politically uncomfortable with the migrants that it does attract and unable to attract the migrants that it most covets. So there is an ongoing political appetite to attract highly skilled migrants, but at the same time, there is a very strong political appetite to play down the influence of more low or unskilled migrants that are still coming to Japan in far higher quantities. Now, there's some evidence that this is changing in the very recent past, but broadly speaking, Japan still has this emphasis on highly skilled workers coming to Japan, who unfortunately are discouraged by the monolingual culture in Japan, restrictive tax policies, and risk-averse corporate governance, which are all very unattractive to the kind of international highly skilled workforce. Simultaneously to all of this, though, we have kind of this other thread of internationalization in Japanese universities, which has been one of the largest drivers of the foreign population in Japan over the past 40 or 50 years. This sort of all began in earnest in 1970s, when the OECD released a report that essentially argued that Japan was falling behind in the internationalization of its workforce and would not be able to keep up with the coming globalization, although it wasn't necessarily argued in those terms. And this was taken very seriously by the Japanese government, who saw internationalization in the university sector, and particularly, even in this early days, the attraction of international students as the route forward. So as early as 1983, Prime Minister Nakasone introduced a plan to attract 100,000 international students to Japanese universities. And this was eventually achieved in 2003. Unfortunately, it didn't really get off to the best start. The growth in the international student population was extremely slow in those early years. And that has essentially been attributed to the fact that they were mainly focusing on English-speaking countries and trying to get people, particularly from the global north, to be coming to Japanese universities, and only in the very elite universities in Japan. However, this was kind of reframed slightly in the mid-1990s, when a couple of changes to the Immigration Act in Japan basically enabled international students from mostly from China, but also from Southeast Asia, to be more easily eligible for a student visa. And that was kind of the opening of the floodgates for international migration in Japan, as they refocused away from Western countries as a source of international students and towards their nearer neighbors. This eventually resulted in 2003 in the achievement of the 100,000 international students plan. And this was very quickly followed up by the 300,000 international students plan, which was the manifestation of the mainstreaming of internationalization in the Japanese context, where it was no longer a concept that was broadly thought about by the Ministry of Education, but there was sort of cross-ministry investment in the idea of internationalization as a way to improve Japanese universities, but also to have those spillover effects for society more broadly. Now, this attempt to attract 300,000 international students was initially, I think, brought in with an emphasis on the universities themselves, but very quickly soon afterwards, the Democratic Party of Japan in 2010 released its new growth strategy that put forward the idea of global human resources. And this is the idea that international students coming to Japan was one way to internationalize and prepare the local population, as well as the international population, to be functional and successful internationally. So broadly, this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour of internationalization in Japan that has missed a few key steps. But one thing I'd really like to focus on is this last little bit here. These, since about 2010, and we saw the mainstreaming of internationalization and the attraction of international students in far greater numbers as the really key goal. This is where I believe we're starting to see this wave of educationally channeled migration as really coming to the fore. The reason for this is that not only do we see that international students had slowly become the largest group of non-permanent foreign nationals in Japan, overtaking some of the long-term residents in different labor-based categories, but also that in the same period, students became candidates for long-term migration. The reason for this is that Japan slowly but surely created a very receptive environment for student migration. This started with the low barriers to entry as a student that we saw in the 1990s, and the slow increase in the economic and social rights that were afforded to students during their studies. But it was also followed up by a number of very important policy changes that helped them in the post-study environment to remain in Japan long-term. The first of these was the introduction of a designated activities visa, which sounds particularly vague, but was essentially put in there to help international students job hunt for a period of 2 years, even if they hadn't yet found a job that would sponsor them in a working visa. So they could stay, work part-time, and look for something more permanent that would sponsor them on a long-term work visa or long-term resident visa that could help them stay permanently. There's also the idea that international graduates of Japanese universities are treated preferentially in the migration system for a myriad of different visa categories. And particularly, this is important in the points-based system that goes towards permanent residency. If you've studied and graduated from a university in Japan, you have a kind of expedited route to PR. Now, what this means is that international students are now the single largest group of foreign nationals in Japan with an established and formalized pathway to long-term migration. This is somewhat representative of widespread trends that we see around the world. This has sort of slowed down, I would say, particularly in the last couple of years, but even before that, we saw a tightening up in some of the major host nations that were relying or were leaning on international student mobility as a way to attract highly skilled migrants. But nevertheless, this is reflective of patterns we've seen before in Australia and Canada are kind of the key examples that we've seen over the past 20 years or so that have really relied on attracting and retaining international students using the same kind of attraction and retention strategies that we're seeing today in Japan. And this is reflective of what we now see and has been described again in the Australian case. This has really been studied in great length, is the education migration nexus, the idea that international student mobility and migration in certain contexts have become entangled to the point where they have merged. Now, I studied this in the Japanese context for my doctoral study with a focus on the agency of individual people. So we could say focusing on the demand aspects that Pei-Dong introduced us to earlier. And I was looking at the different types of resources that students would draw upon to navigate their way through the challenges that exist in migrating to Japan through a student status. Now, I won't go into too much detail on this because I want to stay in more in the things that are more applicable to the other speakers today. But broadly, I use narrative methods to really dig into the agency of individuals and the influence of habit, judgment, and imagination on their pathways. So this habit, broadly speaking, looked at the influence of their families, significant others around them, and these sort of forms of practice that they believed were positive and to be valued, and the influence of that had on their practice as they tried to remain in Japan. Judgment, which is kind of the more critical, the critical stance they took on Japan itself and the circumstances they found themselves in, and imagination, the idea of they were looking towards the future and seeing where they could be in, say, 5-10 years' time if they remained in Japan, and whether that was something they wished to pursue. Now, very, very briefly, the findings of this study was essentially that agency is very dynamic over time. So not only do individuals have very different agentive orientations as they approach this challenge of studying in Japan and then remaining in Japan, but they also exhibited that those orientations changed even within an individual very, very drastically over this kind of transition that they were going through. And what this revealed to me is that individuals' desires must be understood as dynamic. But if we're looking at this from the perspective of an institution, from the perspective of the kind of supply side of this as a university that's internationalizing, if we want to attract and support students through this process, then we cannot simply look at what they say to us in an entrance survey, which is what almost all of the students I spoke to said. They had been asked what their plan was post-graduation when they arrived in Japan, and it was never mentioned again by any of the support staff at the university. I think that this is sort of a rather negligent way to approach this. International students are clearly, at least a portion of them are clearly interested in post-study migration. So this is something that universities need to be alert to. And I believe that the evidence suggests that we should perhaps be investing more in supporting. Now, the reason for that is, alongside this study of agency, I had extremely extended and revelatory accounts of institutional effects. On the one hand, Japanese universities act extremely responsibly as the legal sponsor of international students in Japan, essentially the sponsors of their visas. And all students essentially reported that there was no legal issues. All of their migration status and the administration around that was merely a formality. But on the other hand, any support outside of that was completely informal. And there was a lack of any targeted support specifically for international students for job hunting or finding accommodation or finding employment. What the success stories that I had were essentially ad hoc and were reliant on the individual kindness of people in the administration of specific universities. So what this tells me, is as early evidence of the fact that Japan, although it has formalized its international student mobility and has got the kind of formal aspects of that quite well, they haven't yet recognized the role that universities are playing in actually smoothing that process of international students in Japan being integrated into society. This was matched almost word for word in the accounts that I found from foreign-born faculty in the Japanese context. Now, although they are not by any means the same size of the population as international students in Japan, they are a growing phenomenon that has risen fourfold since 1980, and has particularly been driven in recent years by that little red circle I put on the timeline I showed you earlier. The most recent part there, the Top Global Universities Project, has essentially put the attraction of international faculty in quantitative terms as one of its key performance indicators for those top universities in Japan. And what this means is that we now have a quite quickly growing community of international scholars in Japan. And we also have seen some changes to migration law, which means that not only is it easier for them to come, but they now have greater rights to bring their dependents. So this growing community of scholars and their dependents is kind of coming alongside that enormous, and apart from the last 2 years, growing community of international students in Japan, and are experiencing the same thing. Universities act very responsibly as legal sponsors, and all of those legal issues are non-issues, but there is very little support to help these people move to Japan, integrate into society, both on and off campus. So this leads me now to move forward to really want to focus on the role of that institution between the world and Japan. What is it that those universities are doing? And to what extent are they taking responsibility for the attraction and integration or incorporation of this growing body of international foreign-born people in Japan that are coming in various capacities, but are all coming through universities? The most recent estimate is there's about 360,000 people who are sponsored by universities to be migrants in Japan. But we have no idea how and to what effect Japanese have become these intermediaries, and to what extent they are taking on this role in a formalized manner. I think it has been a relatively broad presentation, but I hope there is some food for thought for you all there. And thank you all very much for listening. And I will pass on to Ian now as the next presenter. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. And also, yeah, really interesting for me because I actually know very, very little about Japan and international student mobility and universities there. So that's great. And yeah, if we move on to the last presentation, Ian, whenever you're ready.
Sure. Let me try and share my slides. Is it showing? Is are my slides showing? Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for attending this talk, and thank you, Ben, for inviting me to, talk a little bit. Share about my thoughts on the status of international student mobilities in Asia. So for this talk, I just really wanted to focus on reflections around some of these emerging patterns and processes that I think would be important for international student mobility. Sorry, I'm smiling to myself because my niece is just decided. Where was I? Yes, some of these broader processes and patterns of ISM in Asia, and I want to focus on regional and digital flows in Asia. So for today's talk, I will briefly explain the impetuses for why I think that we should begin to focus on the regional and the digital. And then I will sketch out some of the interventions and arguments for each of the two lenses that I'm going to talk about. And I will supplement them with some of the sort of nascent evidence from ongoing research that I'm currently conducting at the Asia Research Institute. And of course, Pei Dong is very much integral to this project as well. And then I will finish off the presentation with some concluding thoughts that again will sort of fan out from what Tom has spoke about, into some more focused kind of reflections on the Japan case study, but I want to sort of bring it back out for broader discussion and reflections. Right, so just a bit of introduction to the two research studies that underpin my presentation. The first is the research on Belt and Road Initiative and student mobilities in China and Southeast Asia. This is a new research that has been recently funded by the Ministry of Education Academic Tier 2 grant. The research is only beginning early next year and will finish in 2024. And the main goal of the research is to examine the emerging student mobilities and their attendant educational linkages spanning China and Southeast Asia against the backdrop of the BRI. I think what is unique about this study is that we're not just focusing on the elite academic student mobilities, but really we are interested in the sort of traineeships, as in the case of Japan, right? The kind of vocational student mobilities that we see emerging across China and Southeast Asia. Sorry. But for this presentation, I'll be drawing more specifically from a case study of the Xiamen University of Malaysia, and this study was conducted in 2019, and the data collection was completed just before the COVID-19 pandemic happened. The second research that underpinned this presentation is a more recent work that Pei Dong is very much involved in as well, that is focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on international student mobilities. I mean, the acronym we gave it was COVID-ISM, COVID-ism, right? So this study is funded by the NUS Humanities and Social Sciences Fund. It lasts for about a year and a half, 2 years. And the primary goal is to really look at the experiences of international students at NUS as a case study to help us understand some of the challenges and opportunities that arise during the time of a pandemic. And specifically for today's presentation, I will be reflecting on some of the early findings on their responses towards online learning and the shift towards what wider sort of academic scholarship would term the sort of digitalization term, right? And this research is also preceded by a smaller case study that focuses on the National University of Singapore Virtual Exchange Program in partnership with the Mahidol University in Thailand. So I will be drawing on some of the examples and student narratives from interviews from that particular case study as well. Right, so these two research, I think, are important in the sense that they reminded me of two conceptual handles that are in need of attention. And as a geographer, these are the two things that I think are becoming even more important in recent times. Right? Number one is transnational geographies. What I meant by transnational geographies is the range of academic linkages, the kinds of multinational migrations engaged by students, but also faculty and academics, right? The kinds of translocal subjectivities that are emerging with the introduction of newer arrangements in higher education, such as those of branch campuses and MOOCs. And of course, with digitalization of higher education, we need to think harder about the corporeal virtual connectivities. So these, for me, constitute what I call the transnational geographies. And I think we need to pay attention to scale, multi-scalar politics. And I believe at some point of time, all of our work has engaged with how states and markets and institutions, as Tom has mentioned, the role of education institutions are very important, and how they intersect with individuals and families. And it is through these two conceptual handles that I think, right, remind me that digitalization and regionalization are not inevitable processes with straightforward outcomes. Right? And what I mean by inevitable processes is that digitalization and regionalization are not natural, right? I mean, as what Peidong has said, we need to sort of denaturalize, we need to problematize, right? And these are really processes that are outcomes of policy decisions and assembled by, the collective interests of different nexus. Just a quick run through of the existing knowledges that, about ISM in and of Asia. We know from scholarship that there is a strong role of international education in social reproduction. We know that the role of brokerage infrastructures are very important in mediating student flows. We know that ISM is key to statecraft in national and urban projects and also in projects of international relations, right? And we know that, that ISM is so important because it sort of reproduces and perpetuates co-ethnic racializations and nationalisms. And we also know what we don't know, right? I mean, Leha and Jared Fry recently in a special issue talked about the sort of lack of knowledges in peripheral localities, right? And they argue that a lot of what we call Asian ISM is largely experiences of China and global cities like Singapore and Hong Kong, right? But we really don't have much information from other places in Asia. Right? Now, so what's happened for me to propose the argument that we need to sort of start thinking about regionalization and digitalization, right? The BRI and the pandemic are reshaping ideas and processes that are resulting in new interlocking dynamics across state, market, and individual family. And these processes are economic, geopolitical, socio-technical, and environmental, right? And they are reconfiguring Asian ISM in very profound ways. I just want to point out 5 factors that I think we need to really consider in contemporary research on ISM in future as well. The tensions between China and US relations, right? The strengthening of one China policy that some scholars think have implications on the state of Hong Kong and Taiwan higher education knowledge spaces. Okay? The quickening pace of ASEAN growth potential. And here I want to highlight that we do see increasing interest in universities trying to redirect student mobilities towards Southeast Asia because of the potential growth in the region. The acceleration of digitalization and the reformulation of human capital. I think this is important because universities are increasingly interested in incorporating digitalization as part and parcel of their work in education and learning for particular purposes in the production of humankind. And as the pandemic has sort of shown us, higher education digital infrastructures are often constructed as emergency responses. And these responses, I think, embed new path dependencies in our universities. Okay, so in terms of regionalization, the literature has shown us that there's a vital role for state-sponsored architectures, mainly in the form of high-level policies and regulatory frameworks. And what a lot of these scholars on regionalization is proposing is that the strong role of regions in articulating relationships between competition and cooperation, and these are often underpinned by political economic rationalities, right? So, in other words, regions are not to be taken for granted. Of regions are performative; they do the work of something, right? They're trying to achieve certain ends, right? And these we see happening long before, but ever more important in recent times, the strengthening and the setting up of new pathways for student mobilities. Examples include the new global plan across Australia and Indo-Pacific, the new southbound talent development program that some have argued has not been very successful, and then the Belt and Road Initiative Education Action Plan. Focusing on China and the role of the Belt and Road Initiative, we're seeing Chinese-led projects that are sustained by both what we call hard and soft infrastructures, including concrete campuses, educational facilities, transport networks, as well as the sort of more intangible historical contemporary linkages that manifest in policies, imaginaries, and cultures. Some of these examples that we have identified for further research in the PRISM research that I've spoken about at the beginning of the presentation includes the elite university track, such as Xiamen University Branch Campus in Malaysia, and the formation of the Asian Universities Alliances that is really a brainchild of the Tsinghua University. But I think the more interesting track that we think are ripe for research is that on the vocational trainees, right? We see examples of high-speed railway Luban workshop in Ayutthaya in Thailand that has linkages to the Tianjin Railway Vocational College. Another example in Cambodia is the Preah Sihanouk China-Cambodia Friendship Polytechnic that sees linkages to the UC Vocational Institute of Commerce. So these are some of these newer academic linkages that are facilitating emerging flows of students across China and Southeast Asia. What I want to propose as one possible intervention here is that in terms of educational region-making strategies, we in the scholarship, they are often discussed and analyzed from top-down perspectives, and they're framed within the sort of narratives around economic globalization, and to a lesser extent, public diplomacy as well. And very little is known about the role of personal experiences and responses of students. In the forthcoming paper by my colleague Koh Sin Yi, who's based in Malaysia, we have argued based on findings from the ex-MUM study that I mentioned earlier on, that there is limited extent to which mainland Chinese students perform their expected role as cultural ambassadors at ex-MUM, even though they are conceptualized in policy discourses as dutiful citizens with responsibility to spread the voice of China. Right? Below is just a quote that I pulled out from the paper. I won't go into details on it in the interest of time. And the second part of the argument is that China's economic and political influence frames students' economic senses around their post-study lives, but are informed at the same time by other kinds of logics that point to what I think Payton was hinting around, the sort of alternative conceptualizations beyond the sort of pull and pull and the neoliberal tendencies in our conceptual understanding of ISM. Similar findings are emerging. Liu Jiaqi has a recent paper that I thought was very interesting, where he talked about divergence recognitions. Ravinder Sidhu talked about the potential of effective practices and different ways of dealing regional. And of course, Ben has also talked about the important role of paying attention to individual agency in conceptualizations of soft power. And we argue that even though the current narratives of Chinese internationalization of higher education is sort of depicted as an ever-expanding Chinese presence and connectivity, this should not be accepted uncritically. We need to pay attention to alternative articulations of spatial imaginaries and subjectivities. Okay, I want to quickly move on to digitalization. So in the sort of wider literature on digitalization of higher education, digitalization has often been framed as a pedagogical, for the purpose of pedagogical retooling human capital to prepare young people for an inevitable transition into the fourth industrial revolution. Digitalization has been said to bridge distances and co-presences, and has untapped potential for intercultural learning and cosmopolitan education. And more recently with the pandemic, it has been framed as a solution, right? And this has sort of rekindled potential for transnational education. We've seen commentators speculating about the growing importance of international branch campuses. And indeed, we've seen the sprouting of offshore student hubs, where students who were not able to continue their international education during the time of the pandemic, they were able to do so in the local so-called student hubs and the branch campuses in the country. Right? And of course, the pandemic has accelerated the embracement of the so-called virtual turn. We've seen this across various initiatives, the Erasmus Plus Student Mobility Program, the ASEAN Asian International Mobility for Students, and even the UNESCO sort of framed it as as a response to emergencies that temporarily restrict physical mobility, such that as and when there is an emergency globally, digitalization is the solution to adopt. In the case of Singapore, we've seen how the universities were quick to leverage on existing ICT infrastructures. And these are some examples that has happened in the context of NUS. I'll move on. The intervention that I want to propose here is that given the growing emphasis on digitalizing international education as an ethical alternative linked to the idea of international mobility as privileged practice and against the backdrop of concerns around sustainability, but in fact, we really know very little about the actual effects of digitalization on ISM, right? Based on the study on the COVID ISM and the NUS Mahido case study, which is a work in progress paper that Pei Dong is a co-author of as well. We form the argument that digital platforms may virtually help extend and stabilize students' imaginative, communicative, and aspirational mobilities, but such experiences oftentimes bifurcate along differentiated access to reliable digital infrastructures, right? And of course, digital tools themselves may oftentimes accentuate feelings of immobility and inauthenticity derived from the technical glitches and emotional moorings when students are using digital platforms. Again, I'm sorry, I have to quickly skip through the interview quote. And of course, the project also sort of show evidence of nascent reorientations of particularly Chinese students in terms of their further study and career pathways back towards China. So what they're saying is that I recall a student speaking about how she originally had plans to further a PhD study, postdoctoral fellowship in the US, but because of the pandemic driven racialization and also the health issues concerns, she made the decision to want to return to China. Right? Okay, Similar findings across emerging scholarship. Stein and Gunther has recently spoken about the breaking down of boundaries of international students. There are, incipient arguments around the infrastructures of immobility that allow young people to actively choose to be immobile while gaining access to international education. But of course, I think as Chang and Gomez argue, based on their work on the digital social media use amongst international students, that not all international students are or can easily become digital natives, right? So our study actually shows contradictory experiences that push back against these kind of emerging discourses that potentially celebrate or are celebrating technology-enabled modes of internationalization of education as an ethical alternative, right? Here I'm thinking about, the idea that digitalization itself is ridden with ethical challenges, such as the one that Ben Williamson talked about in terms of the hidden architecture of data. What are data being used for? Right? And also Yang has talked about the monetization and assetization of data. Just give me about 1 or 2 more minutes to close the presentation, right? I also want to argue, based on our ongoing project, that Asian higher education systems and technological landscapes is vastly differentiated. And as such, this kind of digital solutions and aspirations to digitalize student mobility need to be reconsidered in light of the uneven geographies in the region. Right. So quickly to conclude this presentation, I think that regionalization and digitalization are very likely to spur new patterns in Asian ISNs, and they are not mutually exclusive. So for instance, digitalization is a core strategy of BRI's trans-regional projects. And the ASEAN's Virtual Student Mobility Program is closely related to regional cooperation. And these all add to the complexities of transnational geographies and multi-scalar politics of Asian ISMs. The lenses of regionalization and digitalization, on the one hand, can help us broaden the current scope of our research on ISN. On the other hand, it helps to extend what I believe that the current sort of scholarly contributions that we as ISN scholars are contributing have the potential to inform wider processes of transformations because of the kinds of qualitative in-depth work that we do to discover some of the emerging and textured patterns of international student lives. Thinking about regional higher education and digital higher education, I think that there has been relatively less attention on the digitalization aspect of student mobilities in Asia. We practically know very little about these such processes operating in this region, especially in the kinds of peripheral localities that some of the scholars have identified, right? And I want to close this presentation with a final question. ISM has been very strongly theorized in the Western context. The Bourdieusian theory continues to have a hold on the sort of the UK British sociology of education and student mobility. In the US, racialization and theories around feminisms and anti-racial politics. So my question is, what canon for Asian ISNs, if there is any or ought to be any? Right. Sorry for going over the time. So this is all I have. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, brilliant. Thanks a lot. So I'm going to stop recording now.